didn't just howl through the cracks of the single-wide trailer. It screamed. It was a Tuesday in late February, the kind of dead of winter night in the Rust Belt that froze the breath in your lungs before you could even exhale. Inside trailer number 42. At the edge of town, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and impending violence. 12-year-old Leo stood in the kitchen corner clutching his sketchbook to his chest like a shield. The cheap electric space heater, the only thing fighting off the bitter chill since the propane ran out, had sparked and died moments ago. That was Leo's crime. He had tried to adjust the dial. "I told you not to touch it." Rick's voice boomed, shaking the thin aluminum walls. His stepfather wasn't a physically imposing man, but when he was angry, he filled the room with a suffocating tension. "I was just trying to make it warmer. Leo started, but the excuse died in his throat. Rick didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed Leo by the collar of his thin flannel shirt, dragging him across the linoleum floor. Leo's socks slid uselessly, finding no traction. The front door flew open and the blizzard roared in, instantly coating the entryway carpet in white. "You like the cold so much, then go live in it." With a violent shove, Leo was airborne. He landed hard on the frozen dirt and gravel of the driveway, the ice biting instantly into his sock-clad feet. The shock of the sub-zero air hit him like a physical punch. Before he could scramble up, the door slammed shut. The clack-clack of the deadbolt sliding home echoed through the night like a gunshot. "Rick! Mom!" Leo banged his fist against the metal siding, his knuckles scraping against the frost. Silence. Then the volume of the TV was turned up, drowning him out. Leo stood shivering violently, the snow already dusting his hair white. He looked at the neighbor's trailer, the Millers. He could knock there, but they would call the cops. Then Child Protective Services would come. He'd be put back in the system, bounced around foster homes again. The thought made his stomach churn more than the cold. He looked down at his freezing feet, then up at the tree line that bordered the trailer park. The forest was a wall of black, jagged teeth against the gray sky. Locals said it was dangerous. Coyotes, harsh terrain, miles of nothing. But looking back at the trailer with its flickering blue TV light and the monster inside, the woods didn't look scary anymore. They looked like the only door that was open. Leo turned his back on the trailer park. He didn't cry. The tears would just freeze anyway. Taking a shaky breath that stung his throat, he stepped off the gravel and walked straight into the deep, untouched snow of the forest. The adrenaline that had propelled Leo out of the trailer park evaporated within 10 minutes, replaced by a creeping, insidious numbness. The forest wasn't just dark. It was a sensory deprivation tank of white noise and biting wind. The towering Douglas firs blocked out the faint ambient light from the town, plunging him into a heavy, suffocating gloom. Leo couldn't feel his toes anymore. The burning sensation in his feet had faded into a dull, wooden heaviness that made every step a clumsy gamble. He stumbled over a buried log, his knees hitting the hard-packed snow with a sickening thud. He tried to push himself up, but his hands, raw and red, refused to make a fist. "Just rest," a voice in his head whispered. It sounded terrifyingly like his mother's voice before she stopped caring, soft and lullaby sweet. "Just close your eyes for a minute." He managed to crawl into the hollow of a massive overturned oak tree. The root system created a small, cavernous shelter shielded from the biting wind. Leo curled into a tight ball, shivering so violently his teeth rattled like pebbles in a jar. He knew with a strange, detached clarity that this was how people died on the news. Local boy found in woods. It seemed almost peaceful compared to the yelling and the breaking glass he was used to. The cold began to feel deceptively warm, a heavy blanket pulling him under. Snap! The sound was sharp, cutting through the wind. Leo's eyes fluttered open. He wasn't alone. 10 yards away, emerging from the swirling mist like a phantom, was a silhouette. It was massive, too broad to be a coyote, too close to the ground to be a man. 2 amber eyes caught the faint reflection of the snow, glowing with a predatory intelligence. Leo stopped shivering. Fear, primal and electric, seized his chest. It was a wolf. Or a bear. It didn't matter. He was prey. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the tear of teeth, the final burst of pain. "Make it quick," he prayed. He heard the heavy crunch of paws on snow getting closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then silence. A blast of hot, wet air hit his face. It smelled of musk, pine needles, and old blood. Leo flinched, letting out a small, broken whimper. Something rough and wet scraped across his cheek. Once. Twice. Leo opened one eye. Hovering inches from his face was a snout the size of a dinner plate. It wasn't a wolf. It was a dog, a giant battle-scarred mutt that looked like a cross between a mastiff and a mountain range. Its fur was a matted mess of mud and burrs, and one of its ears was torn, a jagged souvenir from a past life. The dog didn't growl. It exhaled a long, heavy sigh that clouded in the freezing air, tilting its massive head to study the freezing boy. There was no aggression in those amber eyes, only a profound, ancient weariness. The dog sniffed Leo's frozen hands, then did something impossible. It circled 3 times in the tight space of the hollow, groaning low in its throat, and collapsed right next to Leo. The animal was a furnace. The heat radiating from its massive body was intense, immediate, and life-saving. Leo gasped, the shock of the warmth bringing tears to his eyes. Without thinking, driven by the instinct to survive, Leo uncurled and pressed his small, freezing frame against the dog's back. He buried his numb fingers into the thick, coarse fur. The dog didn't flinch. It simply laid its heavy head on its paws, its deep, rhythmic breathing vibrating through Leo's chest. Thump, 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 thump. It was a steady drumbeat in the chaos of the storm. You're a good boy," Leo whispered, his voice cracking, his lips barely able to form the words. The dog's ear twitched. For the first time that night, the shivering began to subside, replaced by the borrowed warmth of a stranger. In the brutal indifference of the American wilderness, the boy who had been thrown away by his family had been found by a beast that had no master. As the blizzard raged outside their small sanctuary, Leo drifted into sleep, not into death, but into safety, guarded by the shadow and the snow. Dawn didn't break. It bruised the horizon with a dull slate-gray light that offered no warmth. Leo woke up shivering, the bone-deep cold returning the second the massive dog stood up and shook the snow from his coat. The movement sent a cascade of powder drifting into their small hollow. Leo tried to sit up, but his body screamed in protest. His joints felt like rusted hinges, and his feet were 2 heavy blocks of ice at the end of his legs. The temptation to curl back up and close his eyes was seductive and overwhelming. It would be so easy to just drift away. "No," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep and hypothermia. "Leave me alone." But the dog, Shadow, as Leo had started calling him in the silence of his mind, wasn't interested in excuses. The animal barked, a sharp, authoritative sound that cracked through the morning silence like a rifle shot. When Leo didn't move, Shadow clamped his jaws gently but firmly around the sleeve of Leo's flannel shirt and tugged. The message was clear: we move or we die. Groaning, Leo rolled out of the hollow. Standing up was a feat of sheer willpower. The world spun dizzily. He grabbed a low-hanging pine branch to steady himself, swaying like a drunk. Okay, I'm up," he rasped. Shadow didn't wait for him to get his bearings. The dog turned and trotted north, heading deeper into the timber. Every few yards he stopped and looked back, his amber eyes locking onto Leo with an intensity that brooked no argument. The next few hours were a blur of grueling physical torture. This wasn't a hike, it was a battle against the landscape itself. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed away from the valley floor. They scrambled over granite boulders slick with black ice and fought through tangles of scrub oak that snagged Leo's clothes like barbed wire. Leo's feet were the worst part. The numbness had given way to a prickly, burning agony as the blood tried to force its way back into his extremities. Every step felt like walking on broken glass. "Wait. Please," Leo gasped, leaning against a birch tree, his chest heaving, his lungs burned from the freezing air. I don't know where we're going." Shadow stopped 10 feet ahead. He didn't bark this time. He just stood there, stoic and statue still, watching Leo. The dog wasn't wandering aimlessly. Leo realized with a jolt that the animal moved with a deliberate sense of direction. He wasn't sniffing for rabbits or marking territory. He was navigating. Leo pushed off the tree, wiping his runny nose on his sleeve. He took a step, then another. But as they reached a steep embankment leading down to a frozen creek, Leo's luck ran out. His boot caught on a hidden root. He went down hard, tumbling through the snow, sliding 15 feet down the slope until he slammed into a drift at the bottom. The impact knocked the wind out of him. Lying there, staring up at the canopy of gray trees, Leo felt the tears finally spill over. "I can't do it," he sobbed to the empty forest. "I'm just a kid. I can't do this." He closed his eyes, surrendering. Then a warm, wet nose nudged his ear. Shadow was there. He had slid down the embankment to find him. The dog whined, a high-pitched, empathetic sound that contrasted sharply with his rugged appearance. He licked the tears freezing on Leo's cheek, then nudged his head under Leo's arm, lifting him up. "Get up!" Leo looked into the dog's scarred face. He saw a resilience there that shamed him. This dog had survived out here alone, maybe for years. If Shadow wasn't giving up, neither could he. Gritting his teeth, Leo grabbed a handful of Shadow's thick mane and pulled himself to his knees, then to his feet. He was exhausted, starving, and lost. But he was no longer broken. "Okay, boy," Leo whispered, gripping the dog's fur for support. "Lead the way." Shadow chuffed, turned his head toward a dense thicket of spruce on the other side of the creek, and began to walk. Leo followed, one painful step at a time, trusting his life to the intuition of a stray. The storm had stopped toying with them and had begun to rage in earnest. The wind shrieked through the canopy, whipping the snow into a blinding white curtain that erased the world 3 feet in front of Leo's face. He was operating on autopilot now, his legs moving only because Shadow was moving. The cold had seeped past his skin and settled into his bones, a heavy, aching weight that made his thoughts slow and syrup thick. Just as Leo's knees began to buckle, Shadow stopped. The dog let out a sharp, demanding bark that cut through the gale. Leo squinted against the stinging ice. They had broken through the spruce thicket into a small, sheltered clearing backed by a sheer granite cliff face. And there, huddled against the rock, like a secret the mountain had kept for 50 years, was a cabin. It wasn't a fairy tale cottage. It was a rugged, square-jawed structure made of rough-hewn cedar logs that had turned silver gray with age. The tin roof was rusted a deep orange and patched with moss, and the front porch slumped dangerously to the left. To anyone else, it might have looked like a ruin. To Leo, it looked like a cathedral. "Is it real?" Leo croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Shadow didn't wait for an answer. He trotted up the rotting steps and scratched at the heavy oak door. Leo stumbled after him, his heart hammering against his frozen ribs. He reached out with a trembling hand and gripped the iron latch. It was cold enough to burn his skin. He pushed. The door groaned, a long, rusted screech of protest, but it gave way. They spilled inside out of the wind. The silence hit them first. The roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled to a dull hum. The air inside was freezing, but it was still. It smelled of old dust, pine resin, and something metallic, like ancient cast iron. Leo fumbled in his pockets for the waterproof matchbox he'd swiped from the kitchen drawer weeks ago, a habit born of paranoia that had finally paid off. He struck a match. The flare of sulfur hissed, blooming into a tiny orange flower of light. Shadows danced on the walls. The cabin was a time capsule. There was a rough wooden table, a single chair with a broken back, and shelves lined with dusty, rust-ringed cans. But Leo's eyes locked onto the centerpiece of the room, a heavy, black, potbelly wood stove sitting in the corner. "Please," Leo whispered, stumbling toward it. Next to the stove was a wood box. Leo prayed. He lifted the lid. Dry wood. Someone, years or maybe decades ago, had split kindling and stacked it here, waiting for a traveler who would never return until now. With shaking fingers that felt like clumsy sausages, Leo arranged the dry bark and small sticks inside the iron belly of the stove. He wasted 2 matches, his hands trembling too hard. On the third try, the flame caught. The bark curled, blackened, and then burst into a steady yellow flame. Leo slammed the iron door shut and adjusted the vent. Within minutes, the metal began to tick and ping as it heated up. A radiant, heavenly warmth began to bleed into the room. Leo slumped to the floor right in front of the stove, pulling his knees to his chest. Shadow shook himself dry, sending a spray of water across the room, and then curled up tightly against Leo's back, sandwiched between the boy and the fire. On the table, Leo saw an old kerosene lantern. He stood up on wobbly legs, checked the reservoir, it sloshed with liquid, and lit the wick. A soft, golden glow filled the room, pushing back the shadows of the corners. The light reflected in the dusty window pane, showing Leo his own reflection. Dirt-streaked, hollow-cheeked, but alive. He looked around at the peeling wallpaper and the cobwebs. It wasn't much. It was a wreck. But as the fire roared to life and the wind battered uselessly against the sturdy log walls, Leo realized something profound. Rick couldn't get in here. The stepfather couldn't yell here. The world that had rejected him was locked outside in the storm. Leo opened a can of peaches he found on the shelf, using a rusted opener hanging on a nail. He poured half onto the floor for Shadow and ate the rest with his fingers, the sweet syrup tasting better than any meal he'd ever had. "We're home, Shadow," Leo whispered, watching the firelight dance in the dog's sleeping eyes. "We're finally home." Winter didn't loosen its grip on the mountain easily. For the next 3 months, the cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was a forge that hammered a scared boy into a tenacious survivor. The days were short and brutal. The stockpile of canned beans and peaches didn't last forever. Driven by a pragmatic hunger, Leo learned to read the woods just as Shadow did. He learned that underneath the heavy snow, cattail roots could be boiled for starch. He learned to set simple snares for rabbits using old wire he found in the shed. The boy who used to flinch at the sound of a slamming door was gone. In his place stood a resourceful young man with calloused hands and eyes that held the unyielding calm of the forest. The axe, which had felt impossibly heavy that first week, now swung with a rhythmic, vigorous grace as Leo chopped cordwood to feed the hungry iron stove. Shadow was never far. He was the sentry, the heater, and the only family Leo had ever known that didn't hurt. At night, with the wind howling like a banshee outside, Leo would read old newspapers used as insulation in the walls, while Shadow snored softly at his feet. They were a pack of two, kings of a silent white kingdom. Then the shift happened. It started with a change in the wind, a warm Chinook breeze that smelled of wet earth and pine resin. The relentless gray sky broke apart, revealing a piercing blue. The silence of winter was replaced by the jubilant sound of dripping water as the icicles clinging to the eaves began to weep. Spring had arrived. On the first truly warm morning, Leo stepped out onto the porch. The snow was receding, revealing patches of brown earth and green shoots fighting for sunlight. He looked down at his reflection in a puddle of meltwater. His hair was long and shaggy, his face smudged with soot, but his posture was erect and proud. He didn't look like trailer park trash anymore. He looked like the mountain itself. He looked back toward the valley, toward the town that had forgotten him. He knew he could go back now. The snow was gone, the path was clear. But as he looked at the smoke curling lazily from his chimney and at Shadow, who was happily chewing on a pine cone in the sun, Leo made a choice. He wasn't going back to be a victim. He wasn't going back to be invisible. He sat down on the steps and scratched Shadow behind the ears. "We're staying, buddy," Leo said, his voice steady and assured. "This is our home now." The dog looked up, tail thumping against the wooden planks, agreeing without a word. They had walked into the winter to die, but they had walked out of it reborn.